Our next actually, finally, we actually have a live event next. Michelle Barrett is actually going to run a panel, and I'm going to let her introduce actually the rest of the panel. But actually, let me just introduce Michelle. Michelle is the Vice President for Research and Learning at Edmentum, okay, which is currently serving 8,000 school districts with 5 million children. Michelle, actually, welcome.
Super, thank you. It's my pleasure to help introduce the panel today and get some panel discussion going. I'm noticing that my screen is reversed, so hopefully that's not too distracting for folks. You know, we're learning every day, right? So I know we're all eager to hear some reflections and responses from this panel on getting AI closer to the learning moment. I will share with our audience, if you have questions during the panel, please feel free to enter them in the chat, and we'll try to address them in the short time that we have together. So as Neil had mentioned, I'm the Vice President of Research and Learning Engineering at Edmentum. We serve millions of K-12 teachers and students each year with online learning programs and services. I'm also on the Board of Directors for the Adaptive Instructional Systems Consortium and on the Board of Directors for We Can Learn, which is a nonprofit foundation supporting equitable and innovative learning opportunities. I also chaired the AI and Adaptive SIG for IEEE Icicle, which is the industry consortium on learning engineering, in its inaugural years. Joining us on the panel today, we have Dr. Cassandra Herring. She is President and Chief Executive Officer of the Branch Alliance for Educator Diversity, or Branch Ed, a national nonprofit organization that works with 158 colleges of education and universities across the country. Prior to Branch Ed, Dr. Herring served as the Dean of the School of Education and Human Development at Hampton University. I also have Dr. Nancy Lewin. She is the Senior Director with ACT's Center for Equity in Learning. She previously led a national nonprofit, the Association of Latino Administrators and Superintendents, where she led the effort to increase Latinx leadership in school superintendent roles to mirror the student diversity we see across the country. Prior to her executive director role, she came from a strong background in the field of education. Her experience spans from her start as a bilingual teacher, then onto a school administrator, special education director, and chief academic officer. And then finally joining us on our panel, we have Dr. John Whitmer. He is a senior fellow with the U.S. Department of Education's Institute for Education Sciences, or IES, the largest education research agency in the U.S., where he helps implement machine learning and data science within IES programs. He previously led educational data science teams at ACT Next and Blackboard to conduct foundational research and integrate results into educational products. So I'm very thrilled here to have this discussion with such distinguished colleagues, and I will go ahead and get started. So we have this morning listened to a number of reflections and ideas about the intersection of AI and education. And my first question for the panel is, what do you believe are the most pressing problems we face in education today that are going to be extending into the post-COVID era? So first, I'm going to direct this to Cassandra, and then we'll go from there.
Thank you so much, Michelle. It's a pleasure to be here to talk about AI and education. I'm going to respond to your question really by taking us back pre-COVID and acknowledging the fact that we had certain inequities in our education system in the pre-COVID environment that COVID magnified. And I'll suggest that those same inequities will persist with us post-COVID. I think we have a ripe opportunity in this moment to really think about how those inequities are playing out in our education system so that we can address them post-COVID. For example, there are inequities in terms of technology access, both to systems, computers, as well as internet access. There are also, we've seen that there's been a wide variety of inequity in instruction, quality of instruction, as both teachers and students and families have tried to adapt in this moment, I think we're getting real glimpses in terms of how we need to think more intentionally about how we're differentiating for students. I was very excited this morning about the conversation of, we often design to the middle, but what about the students at the extremes? And again, how can we be thinking about that in a post-COVID era so that we take this moment to learn? The second thing, and I know we're not going to talk a lot about teachers today, but what do teachers need to know in order to be the most successful in this environment? What should we be thinking about in terms of their own technology expertise, and in particular, their ability to help support the social emotional development of young people, even in a virtual or mediated environment? So I would say these inequities were pre-COVID, will be post-COVID, and not all of them can we sort of tech away.
Fabulous. Thank you so much for those reflections. I'm curious if our other panelists have some comments that they'd like to share in response.
Absolutely. Thank you, Michelle. I full-heartedly support Dr. Herring's responses. Those definitely are the major ones that have been magnified due to COVID. And currently, students are having an issue between flexing between online, virtual, face-to-face, online, virtual, face-to-face. So basically, they are having to restart over and over again, which increases the stress and anxiety that they're having. Which in turn impacts their ability to learn and absorb material. So definitely the trauma, we need informed, trauma-informed instruction. And also the students have started to feel that education is not quite worth the investment. So we need to make sure that we're reminding them that there's careers, that there's careers in artificial intelligence, that there's careers across this country that definitely are worthwhile, and that they too can solve problems and open up the pathways to other individuals, which is very important. And that's why diversity does matter. Another area is that we need to go ahead and look at those untangible items. So tangible items are easier to measure. Untangible items are just so much more difficult to handle. But these are the crucial skills that are needed if we're going to be successful from K-12 to higher ed, all the way on through a business, career and a profession. So these are some of the areas where I think that it is crucial that we find solutions. And then also connecting artificial intelligence to really accelerate the learning of our students. I think that is crucial because there are so many gaps being developed. Strata, MarketWatch, so many other reports have shown that the learning gap is even larger than just based on the systemic change that we had, based on the systemic issues that we had prior to COVID. So we really need to find a way to accelerate learning for all of our students. And then, we can really talk about AI and education having a common language. And then we can talk more about that a little bit later.
Super. Thank you. Thank you. I see John has put into the chat a comment here. John, did you want to share your thoughts there?
Sure. I think the first is that the COVID learning loss is a challenge that we definitely all face. I mean, I absolutely echo these are the comments, and it is a situation that there's a very strong role, I think, for AI and the kind of solutions and algorithms that the folks that are here and paying attention to this conference are developing. So I think there is a huge widespread global need that we don't fully understand yet. There's been these point surveys that have been conducted, but I mean, some of the estimates are that 20 to 30% of the students in the United States have just stopped out, right? They just stopped doing school for this year. It gives me chills. Actually, it's pretty terrifying to think about. And there's recognition. I mean, with a new administration in the United States, recognition in other countries as well, there is significant investment that will be made and significant programs that are going to be dedicated to explore this. And we do have some of the work we've been doing in AI, this measuring of these hard to measure constructs, right? Like grit, like curiosity, like leadership. It just so turns out, right, we've been working on measuring these things and figuring out ways that we can tease those out of the data that we have and the data that we are collecting. That I think that, again, people in this community are very well suited to capture. Some of the ways about, I think, to me, teaching to the middle is lazy AI, right? If you're doing that, then you're not doing your job, or having bias in your algorithms, right? You're just not doing your job, period. That's malpractice in a sense of what people here should know about and be doing. And I don't want to start this out with all the problems and horror stories, but I want to instead say that, I mean, there is a well-known need that this community, I think, is well served, and we have been working on kind of tools and mechanisms and techniques, I think, not at scale to some degree. And as Neil said early on, like, sometimes we know we're not quite hitting it, but we know where some of those gaps are, I think, and there's a lot of opportunity for us with the problems identified through COVID to move forward.
Super, thank you. And that's
Michelle,
a very
can I
nice.
jump in real quick? I just wanted to
Sure.
respond to something that John said, and to tie it back to Nancy. Like, I don't know, one of the light bulb moments in when you were talking was around AI malpractice. And Nancy was talking about a shared language between AI and education. What if AI and educators got together to put together a code of ethics, or a set of non-negotiables as we move forward AI in the education space, so that it's not just malpractice in the sense of these folks didn't really attend to bias in their algorithm, but it really is a definitive line that has been crossed. And again, in collaboration with educators. So it's not sort of AI doing it on its own, but it is that on the ground, everyday teacher voice that's also informing what might be those lines to cross. I'm sorry, Michelle, I just got excited.
Absolutely fine.
And we're gonna keep going.
Blow it up.
I have the last question. So I could be short sometime, but I'm short in real life too. But anyway, that we could, I mean, I think that these codes of malpractice, codes of ethics, actually have been developed in response to people doing, bad things. I mean, making mistakes. And, there are several of those frameworks developed by people often in schools of education with an AI kind of mindset, working with collaborators. I'll pop some into the chat quite a bit, especially coming from Australia. They've been doing some advanced work and bringing those back forward. But if you look up codes of ethics and learning analytics, there are some very interesting first principles that, and again, I'd encourage people here to begin with. For some of us, it's not the most exciting place to start, right? The data can be a little more fun, but making sure you're doing the right thing, right, is of course critical. So I think, again, there are some really interesting frameworks, and I'd love to get your thoughts about them. Both of everyone here, your thoughts about them and how they apply.
Absolutely, count me in.
Super, and I think that is actually a really nice segue into kind of where we were headed next with this discussion, was a reflection on some of what we've heard this morning. So we heard, for example, Thomas Frey talking about teacherless education, and we heard Elizabeth Kozlowski talking about educators as mediators of learners' access to tools for learning, and curators of experiences and experimentation. And so for those of you, who really kind of sit in this intersection of education and AI, I'm curious, what reactions do you have? Where are some of the challenges? Where are some of the pitfalls? And how do we make sure that we are headed in the right direction with some of these ideas and notions? And I think I'll go first to Dr. Lewin for your reflection on that.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, so I'm so excited because I can just imagine, you have to dream to make it happen. You have to envision it. And I can really see this big world opening up to us. So between the field of AI and education, we need to make sure that we're going to be serving students. That's really the main focus. And that the common language helps us to interpret what we mean by the needs of students and the goals in order to meet those needs. So we have to look at it within our own context, but then have a common language to be able to communicate and accelerate learning. So there are some things that you can introduce by having that common language. You can remove barriers of dissonance. You can increase the efficiency and the acceleration of learning by making sure that we both in both fields understand what the objectives are. There are some specific things that we can do if we have this common language. So first, we speak the common language, and it increases collaborative quality. We can look to define the needed outcomes for this collaboration, and through the collaboration, we can thoughtfully design strategic planning to achieve focused and driven execution of that strategy. And also, we need to integrate diversity and creative thinking to achieve that problem solving so that AI is more effective and it impacts more students equitably. And then also we need to develop that design for students for learning acceleration, and then use quality communication to enable a higher focus on informing the feedback loop. When you find an issue, you've got to get back together, hone it, shape it, make it better. Therefore, you will end up with more improved outcomes. And then develop new design models that address the value of tangible and intangible learning. You know, when you get to high school, yes, you're learning, right? You're reading to learn, but early on, you're learning to read, but you're also gaining those intangible skills, those skills that are needed in order to collaborate, in order to communicate, in order to work productively with peers. Those are some of the areas that the human touch and the essence of humanity is so critical to maintain. So I just see these doors opening up for AI in education. Super excited.
That's excellent. A few things that you said really resonate with me, Dr. Lewin, especially around, serving student outcomes, thinking about how we're serving student outcomes, and making sure we have a common language around what those student outcomes are. Because any of us who have been working in AI also know that we tend to optimize against certain functions, right? So what is it that we are trying to optimize for our students? And sometimes that answer is not super crystal clear. There are trade-offs that we really need to be thinking through and explicit about. So thank you for that reflection. I'm wondering if Dr. Herring or Dr. Whitmer have any additional comments they'd like to add there.
Yeah, I'll jump in next. I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head, Michelle, when you said, when you talked about what are we optimizing for? What is success in terms of the utilization of AI? I would argue, like others have mentioned in the chat, like to think about education without teachers is inconceivable in my mind. I think the human element that teachers bring to the classroom is essential. It's important. We see that around the country right now with students who are only sort of doing online mediated learning and are stopping out, as John mentioned. We see that in K-12. We are also seeing it in higher education when you see the crisis of college freshmen that are dropping out in mid-semester or not going back, the increase in gap years. Like, I think that sense of social connection is hugely important. And so if we think about what role AI can play, is how can it be deployed to handle routine tasks, perhaps to do differentiation as an augment to what's happening in the classroom with the teacher. Using AI to free up teachers' time so that they can focus more deeply and more intentionally on sort of the one-on-one work with students or in other activities. I think that to me is hugely important if we think about what is the criteria. If we think about academic outcomes, then again, I would encourage us to think about what are those outcomes that we're designing for. And what do we think that technology is uniquely suited to do? You know, oftentimes it's, are we going to replace the teacher? But what is it that technology is uniquely suited to do? And what is it that teachers, even redefined in terms of what their role is, what is it that humans are uniquely prepared to do?
Yeah, it used to be, to me, I thought I was really innovative in saying this idea of augmenting human performance with technology. And now it's like, no, core, like it's the NSF's #1 big idea. So maybe it is, right? It's the, you know, the future of work at the human technology frontier. But this idea that, and it, so I mean, and I'd say, you know, for everyone here listening, like, you know, just your first principle should be, how do I augment and enhance the work teachers are doing in the classrooms?
Right.
And that means, I mean, to the point in the chat, like actually talking to teachers, right? And seeing what they need and studying their patterns and thinking about next, like the context of adoption, right? The context of use, right? That's actually like, that's an area of study. And it's actually an area that frequently solutions fail because they assume a certain context of deployment, of adoption, of use, and that's not what teachers do, right? They actually do something, they use something very different. And then guess what? The technology, the things we work so hard on totally fails because it wasn't used in the way we intended. And so I think thinking about that is really critical. I'd say also, you know, Thomas Fry was he's a little bit contrarian, I think was the intent of that, right? Because the actual video said we need more teachers, right? That was it. His point was actually that we're going to need more education and more teachers, and we're going to need them to, but we don't need the teachers that stand up. I had a teacher in middle school that made us recite the quadratic equation. You know, -b plus or minus, I can do it, right? It actually worked. But we sat for like days and recited the quadratic equation as a class. Like, that's not a good use of her time, right? That's not what we need anymore. And the teachers that want to do that should actually change that. They can change their practices, right? Yeah.
Right,
Yeah, go
absolutely.
ahead, Nancy.
And I do think that that the comment, you know, within context, in all fairness, was also about reaching learners in remote parts of the world and increasing equity and access. So I do want to let folks know that there's an element to the teacher list comment that I think is something we should think very deeply about. I'll also just share, I love the idea of augmenting. John, we spend a lot of time at Edmentum thinking about that, and we think very purposefully about where we need a human in the loop. So where within these AI systems do we purposefully plan to have humans in the loop so that we are, you know, having feedback that makes sense or is meaningful. So I love those comments. They're very exciting. I'm excited. I can hear that there are a lot of opportunities. I am wondering, where do we get started? What do we need to start putting in place to be able to facilitate this collaboration between educators and the AI community? And I think, John, I'll go ahead and have you reflect on that first.
Yeah, I think I wanted to start probably with some, again, thinking of this as an AI conference. What are some of the technology items that are really missing to help make that happen? And I think, you know, first and foremost, one of them is data, is to have the data available to train models to use for AI is something that's often lacking. Riiid made that data available with this data, this very large data set, the EdNet, it's EdNet, right? I think that's the name of it, that they just created, that was used, and Neil Heffernan chaired the competition, and we're gonna see the results in just a few minutes of the competition that was run today. It's very hard to get that quality of data, and to expand that, I think, can really help people with the cold start problem when you're doing AI, right? Like, for example, student textual data, getting student text responses. We're still using data from the ASAP competition that was a decade ago. right? And that's just, well, there's been a lot more data collected, making sure it's de-identified, or maybe it's made available in an eyes-off fashion so that we protect the confidentiality of students. There is much more work actually being done, some work being done right now. I do work collaborate with Schmidt Futures Foundation on some of this, and we will be seeing more of that data becoming available in the public sector, and then competitions launched around it. That's one piece I think is really important. The other is having some of the infrastructures and some of the engines that we create for education solutions being open sourced and made available so that we can rebuild things, kind of the Lego metaphor frequently used, so that we can use things for, say, adaptive, our adaptive systems, or our scoring engines, or our predictive models, right? The predictive models that are being created, especially to predict in-course performance, I've looked at 5 or 6 of them. Every single one uses gradient boosted machines, right? They're using these ensemble models that work very well. Like, that could have been created once, right? Probably, maybe twice, and then you could improve the pipeline. But we're spending way too much time, I think, on infrastructure and pipeline elements that could be purposely rebuilt to really improve the quality of education, and so that we can, kind of like we said for teachers, right, have our AI engineers actually working on AI instead of working on the data infrastructure and data transformations. I think those are some of the most important parts. I think the other piece, then, go back to something maybe a little less technical, is to identify some of the promising practices, some of the promising districts and places where things are being done, and then be able to replicate that, be able to extract out, identify what's working, right? One of the things we said also in AI, the neat thing, like in education, we're often not looking for, we're looking for the outliers, right? We want to know where actually people don't perform according to how they're predicted to perform, right? The point is not to do what you're predicted. The point is to get better and exceed. And so that actually can go in, we can use some different patterns to find that, and then identify what's happening. I think those are some of the things that we could do. And also opening up districts, if people are in school districts and systems that really want to work on these items, right? There can be ways to make this kind of work much easier than it has to be. But of course, watching our ethical guidelines and privacy practices and those kind of things, I think, are critical. But some of the thoughts that I have. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you so much, John. And we do have just about 3 minutes left in this panel, and I know people are eager to also get to the next section of the conference. So I don't want to go over. So I don't think I'm seeing any specific questions coming up in the chat, although some great comments. So I encourage everybody to pop into the chat and see the conversation that's been going on there. I think I'll just leave the last few minutes for any additional reflections that Dr. Herring or Dr. Lewin might have in response to what might we need to do to get started here.
Well, Michelle, first, we need to come to the table together. We need to join in collaboration, start creating that common language. Let's look at the design, and then let's watch out for unintended outcomes that might create systemic issues, as we see already in current condition in education. We want to make sure we avoid that. And I think forming a network of a collaborative group from diverse perspectives, I think will absolutely help, because you're going to get the best from AI world, the AI field, and then the best of educators, as John was saying, those outliers, those people that really are doing some incredible work, but that AI could really augment the success for the students and the success for those educators in order for that to be replicated across the country. So let's come to the table, let's create that common language and start looking at those objectives. I'm just really, truly excited about this.
Super. Thank you. Dr. Herring, one parting thought for us?
Yeah, I think I would +1 both what John said about the data and what Nancy said about the partnerships. What I will say from the experience of the Branch Alliance for Educator Diversity and work that we have done in strengthening partnerships is that we can't come to the table in ways that we have in the past. In the past, it's been very transactional, where ed tech has come to teachers, asked questions, and then gone away and designed, as opposed to really having an engaged co-created opportunity to work together. And I don't want to pick on ed tech. Higher ed and K-12 does that as well, where teacher prep invites K-12 to the table and then says, okay, now we're going to go do our thing. We call that the handshake, like transactional. We'll shake hands and then go our separate ways and do the work. What we at Branch Ed promote is the huddle, not the handshake. The huddle means we're coming together to strategize, to execute, to evaluate on that execution, to think about what's next, to look for those unintended consequences, Nancy, to evaluate that data, John, so that in fact we are getting to the outcomes that we both can believe in. So not just building good tech, but literally moving the achievement of students.
Excellent. Wonderful. Thank you, panelists. This has been a really interesting conversation, and I'm so pleased that you were able to join today. And I think I'm going to hand it back to Neil.